Bill, in your writing, you introduced the concept of recovery rubrics. What are these, and how do they help us look at multiple pathways of recovery?
We've described, Phil, three such rubrics, and the first one is really reflects the very long historical focus on recovery for the individual. But as we got into the 1970s and 1980s, we began to have a number of professionals and family members in recovery really begin to crystallize this concept of family recovery based on the idea that the family as well as the individual is deeply wounded by the addiction experience. And that means that every individual in the family is affected by addiction. The family subsystems are injured and wounded by addiction. And by subsystems, I mean the adult intimate relationship, the parent-child relationship, the sibling relationships, such that as we then transition from active addiction and the adjustments that family has made to that state, that virtually everything then has to get reconstructed in the family recovery process. So we began to describe this larger healing process of families as family recovery. And some of the research was very important here. I particularly commend the work of Stephanie Brown because I think we'd assumed clinically from those of us working in addiction treatment that if we could just get the addicted individual into a stable process of recovery, that much of the dysfunction and harm to the family would naturally resolve itself with continued sobriety. When in fact what Stephanie Brown found when she began to study families was that recovery can actually be very destabilizing to family systems. And that if families don't have what she called scaffolding, these built-in supports, which can come from extended family members or Al-Anon or professional treatment or peer recovery support from other family, that families can actually disintegrate during recovery, and those same families have absorbed every insult addiction had to offer, but only found themselves falling apart in the early processes of recovery. So I think we've learned a lot, begun to learn a lot about family recovery, and are now just beginning to mine all of the implications of that. The third rubric is a very recent one, and I really commend the work, the collaborations I've done with Arthur Evans and Roland Lamb and others from Philadelphia. But in our work there, we began to step back a bit and realize that there are whole communities that have been severely wounded by alcohol and other drug problems, and that those whole communities might need a recovery process themselves. So we've begun to talk about this concept of community recovery, or the idea of the community as patient, and talking about community level processes to facilitate that recovery.
Bill, how do recovery rubrics relate to recovery capital?
Good question, Phil. The recovery capital concept was developed by Granfield and Cloud in their studies of natural recovery. And they define recovery capital as the internal and external assets that allow somebody to initiate and maintain long-term recovery from addiction. So when we think about these rubrics, we can talk about personal recovery capital in various dimensions. We can talk about how do we increase recovery capital for families, and how do we increase recovery capitals for whole communities. And at a community level, for example, one of the things in our work in Philadelphia we tried to do was look at how do we conceptualize recovery capital at a community level, and how does recovery capital relate to problems experienced in that same community. So one of the things we did was a process called recovery resource mapping, where we began to look at problem data related to alcohol and drug problems in the city of Philadelphia by census tract. And then we began to look at the placement of recovery support resources. And that was everything from where are treatment centers located, where are the recovery houses located, where are the recovery community centers located, where are recovery mutual aid meetings being hosted, and matched the problems with the problems with where we had recovery capital resources. And that allowed us to identify areas that had high problem severity, but were very vacant in terms of recovery capital, and it allowed us to target resources within that. So I sort of commend that process of recovery resource mapping, which could be done at a city or a county or even a statewide level.